So, Chris Lewit, a big welcome to Control the Controllables. How are you doing?
Great, Dan. I'm a big fan of the show.
Well, that's lovely to hear, Chris. And it's this is a conversation that I'm very excited about. And we're gonna delve as deep as we possibly can into Spanish tennis. I know that you've spent a lot of time doing that over the last few years, but my starting point, because people are listening and going, well, hold on, I don't recognize that Spanish accent. So tell us firstly where you're from.
Yes, I'm from New York City. I'm an American coach, and I became obsessed with Spanish tennis about 20 years ago. And my curiosity led me to travel all over Spain and study with some of the legends in Spain. And so it ended up becoming a book that's very popular, The Secrets of Spanish Tennis. And that's really how my story began in Spain.
And I want to jump straight in on this, as much as maybe we get you on another time to get your full story, Chris, because I think that's fascinating as well. America is kind of known for staying in their place, and whatever percentage of people who don't have passports in America that we always hear over in Europe, and so for someone to get out there and want to understand that. But my starting question, and we've been looking into it. I've had a good look into it. We're starting to see kind of posts coming out about this. Is Spanish tennis on the decline?
So, yes and no. And then we can get into the complexity. But yes, in terms of top 100 players, if by that metric, certainly on the decline compared to its heyday, where Spain used to have 10 to 15 players in the top 100 for many years. And now I checked before the show, they have 7 currently, and they could easily have 5 soon, which is much lower than they typically have. So, yes, in the news, and you'll hear a lot of commentators say that Spanish tennis is in decline. But I would argue, I'll try to take the position, I'll try to defend Spanish tennis and say the methodology is still sound, it's still effective. By and large, there are some upgrades and modernization that should happen to the methodology. But the system, in that sense, the method of teaching is still good. It's still a good method. And the focus of Spanish trainers, the focus of Spanish training has shifted to international players. And I think that is for me, that's the key driver of the quote unquote decline.
And just to clarify that, we're talking about men's Spanish tennis in terms of the numbers right now. So if we go back to 2001, there was 5 top 30 players. Back in 2010, we had 3 in the top 10, 6 in the top 30. That was kind of the golden era where you were basically Spanish, you were unbeatable. Even back in 2015, 5 top 30 players, and now there's only Carlos Alcaraz in the top 25. And as you rightly say, there's 7 in the top 100. Carreno Buster is holding on for his dear life to that top 100 spot as well. And like you said, that could quite easily be 5 very soon. And there's only one of those players under the age of 25, which is Alcaraz. On the WTA side, and this is something I do want to talk about today as well, Chris, because I've got some opinions on this, having had an academy in Spain for 15 years. I don't think the Spanish system's ever really worked so well on the women's side. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that. But there's currently only 3 players in the top 100 in the world. But if we go back 10, 15, 20 years, there was only ever really 5 or 6. They've never really been that powerhouse. And then the last little, just to throw numbers at you, and I know you know these, Chris, but before you start telling us a little bit more, I think Spain is now currently the number 5 country in the world on the men's side for players that are in the top 100. Your home country, and maybe you can tell us what they're doing right, because I believe they're top on the men's side and the women's side right now in terms of players inside the top 100 in the world. So as into some of the reasons, if we start to kind of unpack some of the reasons why you think that decline's happened, and then certainly like you, I'd love for us to also defend that corner as well, because far from are we sitting here just starting to throw mud at Spanish tennis, who have kind of done so much in the world of tennis.
Yes, just for the listeners' sake, we were talking before the show. This is a complex issue, and there's a number of factors. It's multifactorial, the reasons for the decline. I think it's important, like I like how you started and said, is there a decline? We should establish whether that's true or not. And I think if you look at the numbers mathematically, there certainly is a decline in those top 100 numbers and those top numbers that you represented. There's a number of interesting offshoots here. The WTA story, and we're going to talk about the reasons for the quote unquote decline in the men's numbers. But on the women's side, I think the numbers have stayed relatively stable over the last 30 or 40 years, and I think that's what you alluded to. Probably a handful of top female players. Most recently, Muguruza is probably the best female player in Spain, who she won 2 Grand Slams. Badosa was recently number 2 in the world, which is quite good for on the female side. On the men's side, I wanted to make a point that in the 60s and 70s, Spain only had a handful of male players that were pros. And so typically for the size of that Spain is, mid 40 million, 45 million population count, one of the smaller countries that does well in international tennis, they typically had less than 5 pros, in the top 100 over the years. And then there was this giant boom, starting in the late 80s, early 90s, and then, of course, as in more recent memory, into the 2000s, where typically they would have 10 to 15. And I think as late as 2012, they had 15 in the top 100 of men ATP. So that's a remarkable decline if you just look at the math, going down from 15 to 7 and probably 5 soon, because Agut is also going to retire soon. And Carreño Busta's had a number of injuries. So they've been a little bit unlucky. Nadal had a ton of injuries and retired. Busta was a top 10 player and retired, so he dropped out of the top 100. Agut has come back from injury, but he's going to retire and probably soon. So there's likely they could have 5. And so you have to fill those spots with young players coming up. And that's one of the main concerns, that there's not enough young players coming up in the pipeline. The pipeline's quite thin. But I would take the position that the main reason that the numbers have gone down is a lack of focus at the academy level. Well, 2 main reasons. At the academy level in Spain, at the club level, a lack of focus on native-born players and more of a focus on international players. And that relates to the commercialization of Spanish tennis academies. And at the same time, they've exported their system. So we have this dual negative for Spain. They've exported their system. There's been a diaspora of Spanish coaches migrating to all parts of the world to spread the Spanish way of training. So that's made the competitors better. So I would probably even rephrase the saying it's a decline. I think that Spain has not necessarily done something terribly wrong, but other countries have gotten a lot better. So Spain is here, and other countries have risen up. And in many ways, other countries are using the Spanish tools against them. They've adopted many of the Spanish approaches, and they're using those methodologies against Spain, and that's partly Spain's fault. I mean, they shared their system with everybody, and they invited coaches. I'm a beneficiary myself. I went to Spain and I learned everything I could, and I use that here in the US. And that's happened all over the world. So they've exported their system, they've shared their system with other countries, and other countries have adapted their system and methods, and now they're competing better with Spain. And so they're a victim of their success in that sense. And then back home in Spain, they've been training dozens of foreign players, and those players grow up and take their spots in the top 100. It's a zero-sum game in the top 100. So they're literally training their competition in Spain, and those players are getting the resources. Those foreign players are getting the resources and the energy of the best coaches, and to the detriment of native-born players. So the Spanish kid from the local town is not getting those resources that they need.
Yeah, and just to mention some of those names, you've obviously got Rublev, you've got Kashanov, you've got Dimanua, on the men's
Absolutely.
side, to mention a few. You got Kazatkina on the women's side. So when we're talking about players in the top 100 in the world, or players that are at the top of the game that have been brought up in Spain, I bumped into Alex Dimanua. I was with my son, actually, and his friend. I took them to the Miami Masters, and we went out for dinner one night, and we kind of ended up on the table next to him, and we ended up having a great conversation. And he's basically said, I'm Spanish.
Right.
Yes, I love being Australian, but I've been in Alicante all my life. That's what I do. That's as a tennis player, I'm Spanish, really. And I think your point on that, Chris, is very good. The other point I'd just like to jump in on that, because some people might not understand this as well. But one of the things that shocked me when I moved to Spain, and we've been different in terms of ourselves, Soto Tennis Academy, on this, but the wage of a tennis coach in the Spain is very low, and your kind of
Yes.
average wage of the tennis coach is, 1,200, 1,500 a month. And that's kind of been almost the model that was used, right? And it's being used still in club tennis now, but where the Spanish players, and again, not that it's a third world country, but that did surprise me as well, how little money there actually is in Spain, in most of these little towns in Spain. And, it would be average that they would pay 250 to 300 euros a month for all of their tennis. And that's actually one of the reasons I think they've done so well as well, because they've kind of hunted in packs. The coaches have not wanted for much. Their coaches are always at the tournaments. It's kind of very much everyone's in it together. But now the commercialization of the academies, I'm sure these coaches, and like you say, they're either leaving to go for these higher paid jobs outside of the country, or they've now moved into a position where the academies are starting to demand higher figures that the international students are paying. And I would fully agree with that. You can see that there's the squeeze out. And if I even take, Soto Tennis, and we're not your traditional Bruguera, Ferrero type Spanish academy, that kind of eat your kind of goulash for lunch, and if you're lucky you might get a bit of this, and then you run it, it's quite Rocky Balboa style in lots of ways, how a lot of these old-fashioned Spanish academies were. But we've just had barely any Spanish players over the last 15 years. But what I do is I actually have a Spanish rate. So I actually charge Spanish players different. So when we've got the more localized, I know there's no way that we're gonna charge them the same. So I think that's an interesting point. The point I'd love to also jump in on and get your thoughts on, Chris, is the serve. And it's actually, I didn't say it on a podcast because it was about 12 years ago, but I think, and I need to pull it up, but I think I wrote a blog on this about 12 or 13 years ago. And let me just set this up, and then I want you to give us your expertise in this. I went to a club my first couple of years when I was in Spain. And the Spanish coach, we were on court, and I was walking around the court, and the Spanish coach was sat down. And he said, Dan, sit down. He said, relax, they're playing. They relax. He goes, he said, you British coaches, you're always so busy. You're so busy. You're always so busy. It's good. He goes, also, and he was kind of making fun of a little bit. And he said, you British coaches are the most intelligent coaches in the world. He said, you have a drill for this, you have a drill for that, you have so many drills, you have so many things. He said, here in Spain we have 4 drills. He goes, drill number 1, I stand in the corner, player hits back to me. Drill number 2, I stand in the other corner, player hits back to me. Drill number 3, I come to the net, player hits back to me. Drill number 4, and he was really going on just how simple it was. Now, one of the things as I started to observe was, these kids don't miss balls. These kids are tough as boots. As soon as they're under a bit of pressure, they play up. They're told to play up more, and not. But I didn't see one good serve in any junior tournament. I just saw these I was like, what is that? That's not going to get any competitive advantage on the court. And I didn't really see either a lot of serve plus 1 work, which we know that the game was starting to go into this place. And we saw Rafa do it. I don't know the ins and outs of why he left Uncle Tony, but he noticeably made a change to his game when he went with Carlos Moya, and he started to be more offensive minded with the serve plus 1. And I did have the feeling at that time, and I wrote a blog on it, that if they're not careful 10, 15 years down the line, the game could evolve here. And that seems to me to be one of the problems as well, that that the training methods aren't necessarily bringing out these players with these weapons, these serves, these first couple of touches of the ball compared to some of the players that we're seeing out there right now. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, I think the discussion about the methodology is totally legitimate. And I've also written and spoken for many, many years, just like you, had the same concerns. I've seen the same thing in Spain. I've seen many practices in Spain that are, an hour and 50 minutes of ground strokes and then hit a bucket of serves. The serve is not typically a priority in classical Spanish training. So that's what you're alluding to. That's what you're describing. Fortunately, there are forward thinking Spanish coaches. There are more modern academies that are moving beyond that in Spain. So there are still many pockets of, I would call it the traditional style of Spanish training, which is a lot of grinding and defense and less work on weapons, less prioritization of the serve. So there's a dichotomy in Spain. It's not as simple as a blanket statement that all of Spain is training this way. There is enough of that old school training that you're describing that I think it is a hindrance to developing top players. But fortunately, like for example, at Juan Carlos Ferrero's academy, I think they do a very good job of trying to upgrade the methodology in Spain. Antonio Cascales is very much a cutting edge thinker. He's trying to bring together a hybrid approach, not getting stuck in the past. So I think Rafa Nadal Academy is another very forward-thinking academy. Tony Nadal is definitely not a traditional Spanish coach in his philosophy. He's very much more aggressive. The players, and for example, the players work on taking the ball early at Rafa Nadal Academy. Same at Juan Carlos Ferrero. So in some traditional Spanish academies, they play 10, 15 feet behind the baseline and just grind, and that can be a limitation. The serve is a huge issue in Spain for many different reasons. It's a very interesting topic. For example, Tony Nadal doesn't like to work on the serve that much because he's worried about injury. So he has a philosophy that you only teach, 15, 20, 30 serves at a time. So that can be a limitation if you're overly concerned about injury. So much respect for Tony, but if you have a philosophy that you're worried about injury and that limits the amount of serves that players can hit, that can affect the weapon building of the serve. And just typically, I've been to Spain many, many times. I've been going to Spain for 20 years. And I'll tell you a great conversation that I had with a coach on the ground. It's a coach from Eastern Europe. And he said, I can't stand this training. They only work the middle of the point. They're training the entire day on the middle of the point. They're not working on the return. They're not working on the serve. They're not working on the serve or return plus one. And that is a very common criticism of traditional Spanish training. Like I said, there are pockets in Spain. There are forward-thinking coaches. There are coaches who are trying to evolve the Spanish methodology. So that is definitely a limitation of the methodology in Spain. The serve, weapon building. There's also an interesting philosophy in Spain that the forehand is the primary weapon. Tony Nadal believes the forehand is the most important shot in the game. If you speak with many, many coaches in Spain, they have the belief that the forehand is the most important shot. I can make a good case that it could be the most important shot, but as you know, Dan, most coaches around the world believe the serve is the most important shot in the game. So for a number of reasons, whether it's to avoid injury, whether it's the belief that the forehand matters more than the serve, whether it's just the coaching history, the culture of the coaching, where they've just focused a lot on ground strokes and moving. Piatti's made that criticism of Spain, that they focus too much on footwork, too much on moving. Piatti's a great example of a coach who's exported a lot that he learned from Spain and brought it to Italy, and he's using that to train Italian players. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here, but I think what I'm trying to say is that the methodology itself, if you look at the core, and I write about the core of the methodology in my book, I try to distill it. I think it's sound and it's good, but I make the argument, and I've made the argument for many, many years that Spain needs to evolve. They haven't evolved fast enough, and that is a reason why they're falling behind somewhat. They haven't evolved in sports science. They haven't involved in, as you're saying, the weaponization of the serve, for example, taking the ball on the rise. There are many pockets of areas in Spain where they don't train enough on hard courts. There are still holdouts. Like there are still most Spanish academies have been trying to implement more hard court training, but there's still pockets of good training centers that train, 90% on red clay, and they don't learn to take the ball early or attack the net. So there are definitely like vestiges of the old style in Spain that needs to evolve. And I think the federation should probably take a lead. Somebody needs to take a lead in Spain to try to get the methodology upgraded and evolved.
In terms of the serve, and maybe this is a bit of a comparison with America. In terms of, if we think of the American sports, there's a lot of overhead skill from a young age, right? Whether it's throwing an American football, whether it's baseball, basketball to a degree. Whereas I guess the European sports are all played a little bit more with ball on the ground, as a bit of a generalization. How much do you think that contributes? Because I guess over the years we've obviously seen a lot of big serving American players. You even see it now, even your tier fours who maybe aren't the tallest, but tend to have very quick arms. How much do you think comes also just from that kind of cultural, the other sports? How much of ground can be made up from that? Do you think?
Absolutely. That is a strong cultural influence on the teaching methodology. So that's absolutely a big influence. It's a soccer culture, and Spain soccer is the most the in many ways in Spain they sort of train tennis like soccer players. They work a lot on movement, a lot on positioning, and less on scoring. There's a big focus on, for many decades in Spain, the serve was seen as a way to start the point. I mean, in classic Spanish
Yep.
tennis in the 60s and 70s, the serve was basically a positioning shot. You get the serve in, maybe you kick it wide, and then you start the point with your forehand. And so that has evolved and it hasn't. So it's complex. In Spain, it's not just a one-shot deal now. You have younger coaches, you have a new generation of coaches who are trying to really evolve the methodology, and you still have pockets of traditional coaches who are training in a style that probably is a little bit outdated. It's still effective at some things, like developing good consistency and baseline and movement, but it's probably not the optimal style for the modern game. So there is some truth to that, but I think
Yeah.
it's less of an impact than people want to say. People want to link the methodology with the decline. And for me, I believe that most of the decline is just like you were saying, the commercialization, the exporting of the methodology around the world. Spanish coaches choosing many times because they want to make more money. They want to support their families. They don't want to make the wage that you were describing. And so they take on foreign students, or they take a job in another country. You can't really blame them for that. They're just trying to make a
Absolutely.
good living. I'm a coach. I totally understand that. So, but that basically eats away at the core of Spanish tennis, because they need native play. You need to put your resources and
Yeah.
energy. The best coaches, the best former players, they need to reinvest in the grassroots players, the native Spanish players. And they haven't been doing that, and we're finally seeing the result of that after many years. I've been writing about this as far back as I think 2015, 2016. I have articles going back that far where I was very concerned. I was concerned about the methodology. The methodology is real. That's a legitimate debate and issue. But for me, I've seen a dramatic shift in terms of the commercialization of the academies on the ground. Going back 20 years, I think my first trip to Spain was 2006. It's been about 20 years. And just a dramatic growth in basically commercialization, an increase in prices. I mean, prices of academy trains almost doubled in many places since back when I used to go to Spain. It used to be a place you could get some reasonably priced training, and that's very hard to find now if you're looking to train in Spain. There are places like Rafa Nadal Academy who charge over 2,000 euros a week for training at their camps. This is an incredible amount of money compared to the way it used to be in Spain. We were talking about the financial aspects. You used to be able to
Yeah.
train for $800 a week, $900 a week in a lot of these academies, and you get very, very good training, 2 players per court. And that's changed in many places. Like I said, you can still travel around, try to find pockets of less more inexpensive training. There's just a number of factors here at play. The methodology is definitely an interesting debate. Definitely a factor. I just don't think it's the primary factor. It's the resources of Spain, all of
Yeah.
the wisdom, like the collective wisdom of all these amazing coaches and former pros, is basically going to create. It's going towards the non-native players, and those players get a spot in the top 100, and the Spanish kids don't. because there's only 100 spots. You have 20 amazing coaches from Spain, and they work with 20 foreign players, and they don't work with the Spanish player. That has repercussions down the road, you know?
I want to, what's so interesting? So I moved to Spain in 2010, and I don't know how much you follow British tennis, but if you work in the UK, a day will not go by where you will not have a conversation about the LTA, yeah, the British Tennis Federation. Whether you are an adult at the club, whether you are coaching juniors, whether you are at a tournament, there's an obsession in Britain about the federation. A very rich federation, a Grand Slam federation. One of the beauties, and I want to get into our things that we admire about Spanish tennis in a minute, because there's so much that we do admire, and I certainly do, and I'm very grateful to kind of be a small part of that. I've never had one conversation about the Spanish Tennis Federation in 15 years. Not one. I've never considered them. And I've only ever seen that as a positive. And I'll tell you why, which is a little bit now contradictory to where maybe now it's got to, which is where maybe now the federation or somebody needs to come in and bring this together. Because what my belief always was is I believe that the cream rises to the top. And I think because of the way that the Spanish kind of system has worked, and the competitive structure is so good, and there's so many tournaments, so because there's so many tournaments, there's so many players, and because there's so many players, there's then more coaches, and then because there's more coaches, there's more clubs, there's more academies, there's more competition, there's more people that are trying to do it right. So then what I see, and I used to see this in England all the time, coaches could be quite lazy, because it was like, and they never watch their players in competition, never. It was very much an hourly rate lesson giving culture. Whereas in Spain, one thing I've absolutely loved to see is it's not. It's a lifestyle culture. The coaches are involved. It might not be the biggest tournament in the world, but it's packed with coaches watching the players and really into it, and coach them at the side of the court and working on their games and doing all of these things. And I just thought that whole ecosystem is just been incredible. There's accountability across the board. You have to do a good job, otherwise the players go elsewhere, because there's so many other places to play. And I've just believed that is just built, and the cream has risen to the top. Now, what's interesting, I guess, about this now is that maybe it's reached a bit of a funny place now, where the Spanish players aren't getting maybe the opportunities. They are being outpriced from it. All of the great points that you've made. But I wouldn't know I wouldn't know who the federation are. I wouldn't know what resource they have, and I wouldn't actually know who's really responsible for that. And that sounds crazy after 15 years of living in the country. Can you enlighten us on that? What is the Spanish Tennis Federation? Who are they? Do they have any?
Yeah.
Do they have anything? What's their position really?
Yeah, so this is something that Emilio Sanchez, and I would encourage the listeners, if they're interested in this topic, he wrote an open letter to the Spanish Federation and to Spanish clubs and coaches last year. It's on his blog. Emilio Sanchez is a well-known Spanish coach and former player, and it's a wonderful letter. I actually included the letter. He wrote one of the forewords for my book, and Emilio talked about how he requested that the Spanish Federation, which is called the RFET, take action and try to collaborate more with the clubs across Spain, because there's a club system across Spain, and then there's a private academy system.
Yep.
So he requested that they get involved, because of the situation that we were describing, the situation where most of the resources are going towards foreign players, and many native-born Spanish players are getting priced out, or they're not getting the attention that they could have from the collective wisdom of Spanish coaches. So he has called for that last year, and I don't know if there's been action on that. I don't have a great connection with the RFET. I know they have smaller funding. I know they have a high performance center in Barcelona. They do sometimes take and train players full time, but it's a very small operation. I don't think I'm sure the budget pales in comparison to the LTA. But I think it's interesting what you say, that you like this organic approach to development. And certainly, I think if that's working, it's wonderful. But certainly, a federation can has levers that they can use to try to help. We were talking about setting up a good tournament structure from futures to challengers to ATP or WTA. That's really important. The federation plays a large role in setting up the structure of tournaments. So that's a very important role. I
Massively
think,
important.
yeah. So I think that the federation could try to play a role in incentivizing coaches to work with Spanish players rather than foreign players. There's probably something they could do
Yes.
financially to try to incentivize those very experienced professional coaches. They're all working with foreign talent to try to reinvest it in Spanish players. Look what Juan Carlos Ferrero did. Wonderful example. You know, he could have coached anyone. He was coaching Zverev on the tour, and he left that job coaching a foreign player, and he went to work with a 15-year-old. It's an amazing story. And if any of the listeners have been able to watch the new Netflix series on Carlos Alcaraz, it's just wonderful. It's wonderfully done, very engaging. And it talks about the team and the backstory and how much the pressures that Alcaraz is facing right now. And it's a very interesting story, but it's a very well done documentary. But Juan Carlos Ferrero left from working with a foreign player and invested all of his knowledge, energy, time to Alcaraz. And look at the result. Amazing result for Spain. And if he hadn't done that, you know, he could have, who knows? He could have decided, I'm just going to work with these foreign guys. And if he hadn't done that, maybe we wouldn't even have Alcaraz right now, because without Alcaraz, the news and the commentation, the criticism of that would be blaring. You know, it would be there would be a lot of more critics out there because Alcaraz sort of covered up.
Absolutely.
Emilio Sanchez calls it he created illusion to cover up the fact that they have no depth down below. Alcaraz's success sort of covered up some flaws in the Spanish system here. So I think that that's an important aspect. Could the federation incentivize coaches somehow, or collaborate with coaches, or work to identify young players and get them in the hands of experienced Spanish coaches? You know, and try to work with these academies. There's a deep irony, and Emilio is so insightful, and he admits it in his own post. He admits it in his own essay. He says, "I'm guilty of it." He says, my academies are guilty of exactly what I'm describing. He said, for 20, 25 years, we've been focusing on foreign players ourselves at the Emilio Sanchez Academy. So he admitted that he blames himself as well. You know, so it was a wonderful, very interesting letter that he wrote. He posted it on his blog. So yeah, that's been happening all over the country. That the academies that initially probably focused more on Spanish players and created professionals. Bruguera Academy is another one. You know, they became businesses. You know, they became less of what you were talking about as just passionate coaches working to develop native talent. They became businesses that they're looking to make a profit, and they could make more money from foreign players than the typical Spanish family. So that's what happened. You know, that's where they went with that. Probably somebody should have had the prescience, the foresight 15, 20 years ago to say, hey, if we all do this, in 20 years, we're going to end up with no top 100 players for Spain. You know, we're going to end up with fewer top 100 players. Probably
But
someone should have,
the
you know.
problem there, Chris, the problem there though, and this is where it's going to be really interesting. I think this is a fascinating conversation because having the more involvement from a federation, in my opinion, a federation is there to facilitate. You know, facilitate whatever it might be, facilitate opportunity, facilitate environment, you know, facilitate certainly tournament structure. You know, I said to you off air, my feeling was there was less tournaments in Spain than there used to be. I've looked at it this year, ITF Pro Circuit, men's events, 27 compared to 26 in Italy. So it seems like that's something that they're trying to get on top of as well. But they're trying to facilitate it. Now, the bit that that is really interesting is once federations get too involved and once people start to have too much expectation, and this is the bit that I liked about the organic bit and the fact that there's accountability and people are doing their own things. If you've got a cynical workforce who start to almost go against and then get a bit entitled and uh, and I don't want to just throw the LTA under this, because I think it's the same probably in Australia. It's probably the same in America. I think the big powerhouses, the Grand Slam federations, I actually think, why would somebody working in a club give a shit if the Spain have 15 top 100 players in the world? That's where it gets to, because it almost becomes cynical, and because that coach then starts to go, well, I'm working my nuts off here and I'm going to these tournaments and I'm doing all of these things, but then the player gets taken off me by the federation and gets moved into this place and gets moved into that place, and then you get jealousies and you get broken relationships, and actually the whole thing can fall down very fast. And again, like, just from my experience of the last 15 years, there's been something quite beautiful just about seeing these coaches really, really care about the under 10 team winning the Cadiz team championships. Cadiz is, a province within Andalusia, and that's what it's about. And that, for me, actually is the beauty of Spain as well. There's something, and we had a Spanish kid at our academy. I spoke to him the other day. Good player, probably, for people that know UTRs, he'll be like a 10 UTR, 15 years old. And I said, so you thinking about going to US college? And he said, no, why would I do that? Why would I leave Spain? And then in my head, I'm going, well, where's this going? He actually didn't have any ambition to be a professional tennis player or to go to college. He plays tennis because he loves playing tennis, and he gets really excited for the Andalusian championships. And it's really localized, but for him there's real honor. There's real honor in Spain to win your province or your regional level events, and sometimes that's kind of enough as well. And I think that's what gets a lot of the coaches going and what the coaches have bought into. I'm not sure they're necessarily thinking about this top 100 bit. So how the federation comes in and starts getting involved without losing a bit of that magic, I think is interesting as well, because I've seen with some other nations how that can go downhill quite fast.
Yes, I think what Emilio is suggesting is that they collaborate. The players would stay in the private academies, so the federation wouldn't take them, but they would provide some
Yeah,
funding to try to
yeah,
help the Spanish players.
yes, and
And I would like to make the other point that the federation controls the certification in Spain. So they can do things to get all of the coaches on board with a common methodology. We were talking about how the methodology is an issue, that they need to evolve the methodology. So this is a place where the RFET could play a role to try to upgrade and modernize the Spanish teaching methods so that the coaches in the grassroots are evolving their skills and their philosophies. So that could be another role. I think that's an important role that federations can play, especially federations that license or certify coaches. I think another interesting point, not to undermine your argument about organic, but the idea of this passion in Spain, it actually came from a system of Franco. Franco was the federation in the 60s and 70s. And Franco, I talked about this history in my book. It's really fascinating. The dictator Franco, he had control of all the
yeah,
economic levers in the country. And he happened to be a tennis fan. He loved tennis. He loved Santana. He loved Manolo Santana. And so he felt that tennis would be a great sport for the proletariat in Spain. He felt that tennis could be a wonderful sport for everybody, not just the rich elite clubs in the people that were members of, Barcino,
yeah,
or the rich clubs in Barcelona. So he actually made a systematic investment in the late 60s and 70s to try to build up this club system all across in the rural areas and in places outside of Barcelona. And so he in fact laid the groundwork for this organic growth. So it wasn't purely organic. It was actually
yeah,
a
yeah.
well thought out
Interesting.
investment, basically from a federation, from the government. It laid the groundwork for this explosion in tennis. And so in 1975, Franco fell from power, and Spain became a democracy. And so I think part of the passion that you're seeing in a lot of those coaches is like this embrace of freedom, this combined with tennis. Like, this is a free people that were able to pursue a living in this great sport of tennis that Franco underwrote, basically financially underwrote this club system. and he spread the gospel of tennis all throughout the country. And so I think part of what you're describing is a liberated people, a liberated working class who tennis was something that they could enjoy and be proud of for their country, their newly liberated country, a democracy. And Spain went through an incredible period of economic growth from 1975 until the early 90s, leading up to the 1992 Olympics. There was incredible investment in Spain for the
Yeah.
Olympics. So the Olympics played a big role in creating an infrastructure for Spanish tennis. There was a lot of investment related to the Olympics. So you see this timeline of investment from Franco and investment in the Olympics. And I see the next evolution is that the coaches, unfortunately, or they wanted more money. They wanted to make a better living. They weren't just happy enough with what you're describing. They saw dollar signs. Academies saw dollar signs. Everybody saw dollar signs. Look at, I've been to Juan Carlos Ferrero's academy many times. It used to be a relatively a place to go train. Not most people would go to Barcelona. It's an extra trip to get down to Vienna, to get down to Alicante area. So a lot of people would stay in Barcelona. Ever since Alcaraz made it, you can't even get a spot in their summer program. They're booked out. You call, they say, sorry, we have a waiting list. You can't even come train with us. So this is the effect of when you produce a good player, and Spain in the early 2000s, in the late 90s, were started to produce so many great players. They had people who wanted to come and pay a lot of money to train with them, and I don't begrudge them for that. These are people that are running businesses. They want to support their families. I'll never begrudge someone for that. But that is definitely a reality of what happened. This is a country that was under totalitarian rule up until 1975 when Franco died, and they were a liberated democracy. And the people started to have economic freedoms and economic prosperity, and that's continued now in tennis. It's just been magnified. It's like 10x now, and now you have academies charging 2,000 euros a week, 1,600 euros a week. And if you asked, I'm studied with Luis Bruguera a lot. If he thinks it's insane, to charge that much money. He can't even wrap his mind around it. He's like, it's twice as much as we normally charge. So to the old time coaches, the passionate coaches that you're describing, this is a brand new world in Spain. It's a very commercial, it's a very money-driven world in a lot of places, and that is definitely hurt the development in Spain. And it's like we talked about, it's taken away a lot of opportunities from the Spanish kids.
And do you think that what you're describing, almost in my head, almost there's a bit of a summarizing in this in terms of Carlos Alcaraz versus Rafael Nadal, because Rafael Nadal represents that quite modest upbringing, a tight-knit family. I know Carlos has that as well, but quite when you look into it, not that Tony was a bully, but it was a pretty dictatorship way of working when Rafa was young. Nadal very much represents hard work, reps, discipline, living life in a certain way. And recently we've had Carlos come out and say, no, I ain't Rafael Nadal. I'm Carlos Alcaraz. And when Carlos Ferrero's come out and said, for the first time, I'm actually starting to maybe think Carlos doesn't have what it takes to go on to be one of the greatest players, because he does seem to. I mean, I've just seen him here today in Rome. He's a delightful young man. He walks past, he says hello to everybody. Nadal was this kind of quite intimidating man that walked past. Alcaraz is almost like a little boy walking past. He likes to party. He likes to live a bit more of that sort of world that we weren't necessarily led to believe a tennis player could do, and those representations. But I just as we go through this conversation, I can't help thinking, we're moving, maybe the Spanish system is moving from this just discipline, that's what you do, to now Alcaraz's shot making. I remember seeing him in Marbella about 4 or 5 years ago, and he was playing the ATP 250 when he was coming through, and you could see Ferrero in the corner just like, oh my God, what is he doing? Why is he going for that forehand? But he gets pure joy in the shot making. There seems to be so many differences. Is it fair to say that those are representing the reality of maybe what is happening within the Spanish system or the
It could
Spanish
be.
tennis culture?
It definitely could be. I think you make a very interesting point that those you see it may perhaps a generational shift. I think it's still up for debate whether the future Spanish players will have the willingness to sacrifice like Nadal did, and that is a chapter in my book on suffering. The willingness to suffer and sacrifice is a huge part of the Spanish ethos, the huge part of the philosophy and character. Tony Nadal definitely imparted that on Rafa. And I think Alcaraz has put in a lot of suffering and hard work. But what you're alluding to is I think there's definitely some concerns in his team that he said that he's feeling a lot of pressure and he's feeling a lot of obligation. He used the word obligation, all of the pressures of the tour, and he's not enjoying it as much. The team is clearly very concerned. I also saw that quote from Juan Carlos Ferrero, and the first thing I thought was he may not stay in this relationship much longer because he's a very serious coach with very high standards. If he feels that, and he said so as much, if he feels that Alcaraz is not, fully dedicated to being one of the best players of all time, he said he will leave. He said he would leave. So I thought that was a pretty striking quote, the one that you referenced from his coach.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Alcaraz could be the new generation of Spanish kid. We'll have to wait and see. I'm not sure if you can expand that and broad brush the culture, but certainly there is the question, are Spanish players going to be as willing to suffer as they were in the past? And going back more than a generation, like we were saying, this is a country that emerged from a dictatorship. They emerged from a totalitarian rule. They were oppressed. The people were oppressed, and they lived under harsh rule. Many of the newest, the new generation, they have no experience of that. They have no relationship that they don't know what that's like. They don't know what it means to suffer like that. For them, maybe they take tennis for granted. In the first generation or two that is still connected to the rule of Franco, those people probably really appreciate tennis a bit more because they get the joy of being free and liberated and being able to play tennis. Probably they appreciate it a bit more. Probably the young kids, the remember, they have no concept of what that's like to suffer under a dictatorship. They lived in a democracy and a flourishing democracy with a lot of modern conveniences and luxuries. And as you know, luxuries can sometimes affect the player's motivation and affect the player's desire and hunger and willingness to suffer. That can be a factor. So there could be a cultural element there that's affecting Spanish tennis. I don't think it overshadows the shift from focusing on foreign players. And I think that if the methodology wasn't still working well, the foreign players wouldn't keep coming. You wouldn't see the success of, like, you forgot to mention Xin Wen. I mean, Xin Wen from China, incredible story, who was trained in Spain, based in Spain, Spanish coach, who won the Olympics for China. I included her success in my book, and there's a number of other stories that we didn't mention either of just the Spanish methodology. It's still working. It does need to be updated. But if it wasn't working, if it was the methodology itself, then the foreign players wouldn't be having success, right? I mean, that sort of validates the methodology. The fact that foreign players, some of them are paying a lot of money, foreign governments and countries are paying a lot of money to send players to Spain, I think that still validates the methodology, even though we pointed out some of the deficiencies like the serve or working on serve plus one or weapons and things like that. I think there's a
But I
deep
think
irony
this.
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Chris. I think this kind of the picture is becoming certainly a bit clearer in my head as well with this conversation, in terms of a few dots are being joined together for me, in terms of, and I'd like to touch upon Spanish men versus Spanish women as an example. From what I've seen over the last 15 years, males in general hunt quite well in packs, ego, push each other, competitive, traveling together. I can beat you, you can beat me. We push each other along. Females in general require a bit more individualized attention, have maybe different game styles, and I guess the traditionally we thought of the female game as being kind of this first strike tennis type thing, which doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with hitting together or sparring together, because a practice session is not so, it's not so conformed, right? If I go out and play with you, Chris, and we're looking for rhythm, and I'm changing line, going 2 cross 1 line, and we're doing that, it kind of works nicely together, and I get a nice practice, and you do. If we're working on me serving out wide, then me smacking the ball early into the space, that's kind of a crap practice for you, right? And the bit I'm trying to join the dots with here is the way that the game is evolving maybe does require more individualized attention, and in terms of how the players' games are developed, and I guess the personalized nature of that. I certainly see that in the marketplace right now. People come to the academy and everyone wants extra private lessons, and everyone wants this, and they want to, they don't want to necessarily just come in and do the drills that everyone else does. They want to feel that, and I understand that, and that would be certainly part of my philosophy as well, that every people do have different strengths and weaknesses, and everyone's got their own ways of trying to win the points. And we now know statistically 65-70% of the points, you only touch the ball twice. So how are you doing that effectively? How are you getting on top of points? How are you not breaking down in points? And I do just wonder a lot of this, and without coming to absolute conclusions, of course, because there are many factors, as you've touched on them beautifully, Chris, so many of them. But I do just wonder if that is all tennis players now are what we traditionally thought women were, that women needed. They needed their coach and their way of working on their individualized game. Boys can just go out there and hit loads of balls, and they'll compete, and they'll find their way. Whereas now, more and more, that's what people need. So if let's take Kin Wen. Okay, yes, it's the Spanish system, but you can almost guarantee it was a one-on-one setup. Pretty much, or it was a very small setup. I can't imagine she was just going out there and playing in squads at one of the academies, and doing the basket drills with everybody else all day, every day. I would imagine it was very personalized, and that the bit that then adds on from that personalized is more expensive.
Yeah,
The
I think.
sport, it becomes very hard to be able to do it all in that way as well.
Yeah, I haven't heard that perspective on the individualization and linking it to the lack of female players in Spain. It's an interesting argument. Certainly, just to touch on private lessons, I have seen in the last 20 years of my travels to Spain, in the early years, most places didn't do any private lessons, and Luis Bruguera never wanted anyone to do private. Many academies would refuse. They would refuse requests to do private lessons, and they say, no. Our 2 players per court on the group that is technically a semi-private. That's enough. We typically don't need. So there was a lot of pushback against foreign families who came in and asked for private lessons. That's a common demand from players,
Yep.
families coming in from all over Europe, including England and Eastern Europe, and especially America. As American families started coming to Spain, they all wanted private lessons. And eventually, most of the academies caved to that. And over the years, I saw most academies start to offer private lessons, which they never did in the past. So that is an interesting trend. It relates to the commercialization of training, because you can charge more for the coaches can charge. They can make extra money, basically, for a private. So that is an interesting development. For me, why are there so few female players coming out of Spain? I think a lot of it's cultural, where the boys are expected to be athletes and the girls are sometimes steered to other things. So you have a cultural aspect that's very prominent in Spain. I think there's a real chauvinism in Spanish coaching. There's a macho culture.
There is, yep.
I've seen many girls in Spanish groups or in Spanish training programs basically be neglected. Like the boys would get most of the attention, and the girls would be left, sometimes on their own on a far court. You could clearly see that most of the coaches in Spain are male, like the hugely dominated male world of coaching. They really need more female coaches in Spain. But it's a male-dominated culture. It's a very chauvinistic culture. where a sort of male-oriented culture. Look, I try to talk about female tennis and I try to talk about female players from Spain and my book and in articles, because I don't like to be only focused on the ATP. You know, we say Spain's in decline, but we're talking about men. We're always dominated with a male perspective. You know, there have been some successes on the female side. Muguruza is one that I always try to bring up, who moved to Spain from Portugal, I think, or Venezuela, and
Venezuela.
she took on Spanish citizenship. See, that's the way to do it. You get a foreign player, and they switch their citizenship. Now you get a player that counts for the top 100. But if she had not changed her citizenship, or I don't know, maybe she had dual citizenship. She may have had dual citizenship, but anyway, so she plays for Spain. She plays for the Spanish flag. So that's a great setup. You know, she came as a foreigner, and she was a great, very, very successful player. Arantxa Sanchez Vicario was a tremendous player. A lot of people forget. Talk about, she played a Spanish game, very successful Grand Slam winner from an amazing family, the Sanchez family, incredible tennis family. Javier was a top player, Emilio, Arantxa. It's an incredible dynasty, that Spanish family. Very interesting story there. But yeah, the women typically, if you look at a Spanish practice, I'm a very astute observer of Spanish practices. That's how I ended up writing the book. You see the girls, the coaches are spending most of the time talking to the boys. Like you said, it's kind of a boys' culture. The girls are maybe serving alone, basket, you know, or the coach works with the boys with a higher intensity and the girls less. You know, there's a chauvinist mindset that we don't want to push the girls too hard. You know, this is sort of like caveman thinking. You know, there's the idea that when the
Yeah.
girls are young, we shouldn't like young. I brought many American kids to Spain. I brought teams to Spain for years, decades. And you know, usually the young girls are, you know, the male coaches say, you know, we don't want to. They're young, they're girls. We don't want to push them too hard. You know, there's definitely something there that I think is real culturally that has prevented
Hmm.
this. It's definitely a factor in the development of female players. And then there are some highlights. There are some coaches in Spain who specialize in females who do a great job, and they evolve the Spanish system. They adapt the Spanish system. They individualize the Spanish system for female players, and it's wonderful. You know, I'm thinking of Pancho Alvarino, for example, who's a wonderful girls coach in Spain. Maybe the audience may not have heard of him, but incredible female coach. So you have Pablo Lozano, Lozano Autor is a very good female coach. You have some coaches in Spain who dedicate and adapt the system to girls, to females, and it works. But there's very few of those. This is a very male-dominated, male-oriented boys' club. You know, so I think that is a
But
very
that's
real
my point.
cultural
That's my
factor.
point, though, Chris. That this is my point: is are we not at the stage now in 2025 where actually we're adapting a system for an individual, regardless of whether they are male or female? And if we take, like, Carlos Alcaraz does not play in a typical Spanish way in any shape or form. You know, like, it really, I mean, he does, there's certain aspects, racket head speed, you know, there's certain things that you would, but Carlos Alcaraz is playing a very, very different brand of tennis that has been developed in an individual way with certain aspects of the system. And that's my point, is I believe tennis now is at the stage, like, I know Jack Draper's upbringing very, very, very well, and he's coaches, fantastic coaches over the years. It's not been necessarily a systematic approach per se. It's been a systematic approach on developing Jack Draper with certain common common denominators within that.
Absolutely.
Whereas I think gone are the days maybe that, you know, a quick little story, because I also know we don't have long left, Chris, but there's a guy, and he won't mind me mentioning him, Ricardo Rodriguez, Venezuelan player, but basically foreigner in Spain, brought up in Alicante, Valencia, and very much the Spanish way. And he got us maybe up to 270 ATP. And he was out injured for a year or so. He came and did a couple of sessions with me last year. And we had this big discussion. And he was like, the things I did 3 years ago, 4 years ago, that were helping me win futures just don't work. It doesn't work anymore. He said these players are just pulling the trigger from all parts of the court. And he said it's so hard for me to do it because I've got the voice, and I don't know exactly who his coach was, but he said I've just got the voice of my coach in Valencia say, like, if you do that, you're running. That ball goes up and back through the middle. That ball does not go straight down that line. So he said, I've got these things so inbuilt in me that I now playing against these youngsters who are just getting in behind the ball, getting the outside foot and behind the ball without any smart and just pulling the trigger. And I'm trying to outsmart them. I'm trying to use the patterns that I've been taught for so long. And I just think when we're talking about it at a higher level, and when I say a higher level, I've always thought of it, that system and that way of people playing and those patterns and that just the whole thing, which has been fantastic. I think it's unbelievable at helping players go from being average to good. And it makes so many people, but people going from good to great needs more, and in 2025 even more so.
I think that's a great point, and I do see the Spanish method. Some of the Spanish coaches object to it. Some call it a system, some do not. Some practitioners in Spain prefer you not use the word system. Some people prefer to call it a methodology, whatever, however you want to call it. There's a structure of training. There's a commonality in some drills. I talk about this a lot in my book. But yeah, there is a common method, and I think you're absolutely right. It's a great way to make players good, to build an armada of soldiers. It's really good at making players. It's an efficient way to make players good. And I think you're absolutely right that great coaching is individualized. I don't care what country you're in or what system you're operating under. Individualized training is I think optimal. And I think that in Spain, one of the ways they have been able to individualize it because they have typically two players per court. I've never seen that ratio before. Before I started traveling to Spain, I never saw groups like that. A typical group has two players. So the coach is able to individualize within the methodological framework. The coach is able to select exercises and give each player basically a semi-private each day. For example, at BTT, I spent a lot of time at BTT, Barcelona Total Tennis, and they adhere to this ratio, and it's really beautiful. Even in the summer during camp time, sometimes they have one player with a coach, sometimes they have two players with a coach, and that's typically the maximum. And it's a very special thing for a coach to be able to work in that environment because especially young coaches who are learning, they're able to give their time and attention to individualize the training like you're suggesting is so important. So I think that's been a strength of Spain even for a long time.
Absolutely.
Rather than sticking to a strict a strict system. That Luis Bruguera, who I've studied with the most in Spain, spent many years. He's been a mentor of mine. He always believed that you try to take the exercises and find the right exercise for each individual. You always adapt. And I believe his system, his method was a bit more flexible than for example, the legendary Pato Alvarez. William Pato Alvarez had a more structured, rigid system of drills that you had to do daily, typically. So I would also say you mentioned Alcaraz. It's very interesting. I have a chapter on Alcaraz in my book. I call his tennis Spanish tennis 2.0. He's definitely more of a shot maker and less patient than you typically see in Spain historically. I think, Dan, you'd be interested to know that I have many coaches in Spain, friends of mine, who say that Alcaraz has made our job a lot harder. He's made our job much more difficult to teach kids to be solid, to be patient. They see Alcaraz try these incredible shots, and all of the kids in Spain and all the kids at the academies, they want to copy that.
They're lucky Kyrgios is not Spanish.
Right, but Alcaraz, he has that panache, he has that style, he's a shot maker, so kids want to copy him. He's made the drop shot very popular. I never could convince parents to let me teach the drop shot 10 or 15 years ago. I was the one who had to push it. And nowadays, I have requests to teach the drop shot to everybody. It's the Alcaraz effect. Everybody wants to learn a drop shot. All the kids try it now. But his team, I think his team at Juan Carlos Ferrero, they're so brilliant. I think Antonio Cascales, I have a chapter on Cascales in my book. I call him the other Tony. He's the Tony that nobody's ever heard of. Everybody knows Tony Nadal, but Tony Cascales, he's brilliant. And basically what he does that individualization that you're talking about. He's taken multiple influences from Spain, from Pato Alvarez, from Luis Bruguera, and he's hybridized that approach. He's very flexible. He works with the individual. He works with the player. And you see Alcaraz as a product of that approach. Alcaraz was allowed to express himself. He was allowed to play in this different style,
Yep.
where Alcaraz probably would have been shut down at a traditional Spanish academy. He wouldn't have been allowed to flourish. And I think that's one of the genius aspects that Juan Carlos Ferrero and Antonio Cascales. Cascales was Juan Carlos Ferrero's original coach. And now they run the academy together in Vienna. It's a small town in Spain. And I think one of the brilliant things that they did is they've taken sort of the grit and the toughness and the sacrifice and the suffering, and they've sort of blended it with the flexibility and the individualization that you're talking about. I think that is like the optimal way to do Spanish training nowadays, you know. So I think that's a great example, and Alcaraz is a product of that.
Chris, I think it's a great way to end it, actually, in terms of my last question was going to be what's next, but what you've just said there in the last 30, 45 seconds, I guess that's what's next, right? It's the hybrid approach, the individualization of it. Is there anything else you want to add on what you think's next over the next few years?
Yes. I wrote a chapter at the end of my book about this, and I don't know what's next. I put a lot of thought into it. You know, I've spent almost 20 years studying Spanish tennis, so I think about it a lot. Like, what's going to happen with Spanish tennis? And I think I can go a few different ways. Spanish tennis could basically maintain 5 or 6 or 7 players in the top 100. We're talking about ATP, and that would be a pretty good result for a relatively small country in Europe, you know. Or some of these, I have a new article that I wrote, an action plan for Spanish tennis. Maybe either the federation or the academies will come together and try to refocus on native-born players. I'm really curious to see if they're able to do a shift like that. That is a pretty big ask. You have a lot of academies with a lot of different commercial interests there. Can the country come together? And maybe this will be a wake-up call, because the numbers are dwindling and there's going to be more and more news about it. I think the mistake in the news is to say the methodology is so flawed that it doesn't work, because foreign players are still being trained with this methodology. It's still working. It can be improved, as we talked about, but it's still working in many respects. But there's been a huge absence of a focus on native-born players. Are you familiar with TEC? Are you familiar with the TEC initiative, Tennis Empowerment Center, which is a really big story in Spain that I'm trying to share with everyone?
Yeah,
It's
I've heard little bits about it.
It's unbelievable. I was just in Spain in October at the TEC Training Center, which is it's a shared facility at the Up Club in Barcelona, and I have many friends there from Bordeaux, which is basically the former Bruguera team. So I was on site there in October, and I watched all the TEC coaches working, and I was really, really impressed by their professionalism. And I wanted to learn more about it, and I learned that they're building a 20 million euro facility in the north of the city. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that this is it's a really interesting narrative. It's a nonprofit investment in Spanish players. So rather than go the federation route, this very wealthy nonprofit, Carles Ferrer Salat was a banker. He was a very wealthy businessman, and he was an economic leader in Spain. And he left he left this nonprofit, and he wanted the nonprofit to. He was a tennis player. He was a tennis fan. He was a tennis player. And so this is a very new initiative. I believe they started up in 2020, 2021, early 2020s. This is brand new. And they have a whole team of professional coaches. They have Albert Costa as their technical director. They're building a 20 million euro facility in the city, in the north of the city. It's incredible. And they're putting a big investment in Spanish players. So they're actually doing what we're suggesting, but they're not going the federation route at all. They're going the nonprofit route. They're bypassing the politics. They're bypassing the federation, and they're just funding this with Carles Ferrer Salat's basically endowment. So it's a really fascinating initiative, and they're super professional, Dan. I'm curious to see if they're going to be able to start producing some players that make the top 100. That's their goal. So It's just that's a
Wow.
fascinating side story in Spanish tennis that's happening right now, and it's unfolding as we speak. And then there's the question of, can we get the academies and the clubs to maybe collaborate with the? I know you want more organic, but can they collaborate some in some ways with the federation to try to get attention for these Spanish kids and just try to turn the ship around a little bit?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add on that as well, in terms of these initiatives, the one thing I haven't said, and I think it's a really important point to make, is there is an incredible amount of highly competitive and highly skilled junior tennis players in Spain. Like an incredible amount, and I see it. I see it with my academy. My son plays. My son's 14, and genuinely, you're talking about there being 2, 3, 400 players of every age group, that play to a very good level, the smaller countries. So by getting some of those infrastructures and ecosystems right, they're certainly not lacking young talent, and they're certainly not lacking young, competitive, passionate talent as well.
And that could bode well for the country. And the other question is the methodology. Can the country come together and evolve their methodology? Can they counter? They've spread their methods all around the world. They basically trained many other, they've shared their methodology with many other countries. Dan, my first trip to Spain, I went to Sanchez Casal, then Sanchez Casal, now Emilio Sanchez Academy. And I sat with Sergio Casal, and I remember vividly the conversation I had with him. I was a young coach, and I said, "Why are you sharing your methods with me? Like, why would you do that?" I was from New York, which is like hyper competitive, and I was like, "Why would you share that with other coaches who are going to compete with you?" And he's like, "Well, we believe in sharing. We're proud of our methodology. Also, Pato Alvarez, the methodology of the Sanchez Academy is based on Pato Alvarez's philosophy and methods and system. And he wanted to share his methods with the world. He believed he was the best coach in the world, and he wanted to basically export his knowledge to everybody. He believed his method was the best in the world, and he wanted everybody to know about it. And so that 20 years later, it's happened. Like everybody knows about Spanish training. I wrote a book on Spanish tennis. We have the internet, we have YouTube, we have videos. People can learn about Spanish tennis. So the secret's out. Like the system's out, the method is out there. And then on top of that, all these great Spanish coaches got hired in other parts of the world to teach the Spanish method. And Spanish academies started setting up in Asia. There's so Spain has basically the Spanish gospel has been spread all over the world. And so everybody knows about it. So Spain needs to take a hard look in the mirror and say, how are we going to compete with ourselves? We have to evolve. We have to do better and evolve our own methodology so that we can compete with the people that are using our tools. I think that's really important. Evolve the methodology and then try to get more focused on the Spanish kids.
You're an absolute star. Thank you for coming on. But do you have 2 minutes for our quick fire round?
Absolutely.
You don't come on Control the Controllables without the quick fire round.
I'm a little nervous.
Clay courts or hard courts?
You have to train on both. Have to.
Serve or forehand?
You need both. They're the most dominant weapons in the game. You need a weapon serve and the forehand weapon. You need them both, and you got to use them both to complement each other. Sorry, I'm dodging here.
I think I'm going to have to clarify the quick fire round here. So the quick fire round is you choose one or the other. It doesn't work if you say both to all the answers. Just to be clear.
All right, I'm gonna try here.
Forehand or backhand?
Forehand.
Vamos or venga?
Vamos.
Rafa or Carlos?
Rafa.
Arancha or Garbine?
Arancha.
Over the next 10 years, will Spanish tennis decline further or rise again?
Rise again.
Work hard or work smart?
Work smart.
Because that's where I think the methodology needs to keep evolving as well.
Absolutely.
Always. Not just Spanish, but all methodologies. Who do you think the singles French Open winners will be in 2025, men and women?
Oh boy. I'm gonna say Iga and Carlitos. Is Carlitos playing or he's out?
No, Carlos is good. He won in Rome today, so he's fine.
Okay, I'm going with Iga.
He's going to be
Iga
fine
and
for
Carlos.
Paris.
Iga and Carlos.
What's one rule change you would have in tennis?
One serve. One serve, Dan.
And what's one change you would make to the Spanish system?
Focus on the serve. Make the serve a priority, please.
What, that kick serve, that one serve kick serve that you're going to get? Because you've already changed the rules of tennis.
I had to choose something. That I was going to say wooden rackets. I went with serve.
And who should our next guest be on Control the Controllables?
Spanish guest?
Any guest, but you're responsible, so think carefully.
You should try to get Antonio Cascales. He's a genius. He's an unsung hero. Nobody knows about him. He's amazing. His English is very poor, though. You need a translator.
Do you have the hookup?
He's the other Tony, the unsung hero of Spain. He's developed 2 number 1 players in Spain, in the world, and nobody knows about him.
Incredible. Chris, this has been a massively insightful conversation, a one that I've loved, a one that's gone very quick for me, a one that I could have continued. I'm sure we could have jumped into lots of rabbit holes. I think we need to do this again. But a big thank you to you for coming on. A big well done for all of your contributions that you're giving to the tennis world, and to be sharing this incredible knowledge with us as well. I'm sure lots of people will want to read the book and the updated version, and we will have all of those links in the show notes as well. But just want to say a big heartfelt thank you from Control the Controllables.
Thanks, Dan. It's a great conversation. Keep up what you're doing with the show. I'm a big fan, and you provide a valuable service for the tennis community. And we'll see what happens with Spanish tennis. We have to keep watching and see if they can rise again.
Absolutely. Thank you.